All right, Charlie, wake up so that you can hear this.
Charlie chose not to wake up.
Charlie chose not to wake up. She's a dog. She doesn't care about comics.
From ScienceSortOf.com, you're listening to Science Sort of.
Hello and welcome to episode 308 of Science Sort of. Our theme this week is Draw It Out. I'm your host, Ryan, and joining me to talk about things that are science, things that are sort of science, and things they wish they were science is the person sitting next to me, my wife, Juliana Olson.
Hello.
Hey, Julie, how you doing?
I'm doing just fine, as you can see.
I brought you on this episode for a couple of reasons. One, you are a fan of comics.
Yes.
And Patrick and Charlie keep having scheduling conflicts, and so we haven't been able to record.
That is true as well.
So, when I say draw it out, I'm not referring to an overly long show. I'm referring to an interview with two guys who like to draw their science. One is Jason McDermott, who is at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and Matteo Farinella, who is at Columbia. And the thing that unites them is that they are both scientists who like to draw comics. And so they hosted a session at the annual meeting of AAAS. What does AAAS stand for, Julie?
The American Association for the Advancement of Science.
Correct. And that was here in DC, and I went as press and did a couple of interviews. Not as many as a meeting like AGU, where I know a lot of the folks involved, but a few. So the next couple of episodes are going to be AAAS episodes. And their session at that meeting was Scientists Who Draw Comics, the double life of visual science communicators, which is pretty cool.
Pretty cool. So how many people were on that panel? Or?
It was the two of them leading the session. So it was sort of they each kind of gave a brief talk about their role, the way that they use comics to communicate their science. So Jason does a webcomic and has actually done entire conference posters as comics.
Nice.
And then
that's the way to do them.
Yeah, and then Matteo does like fully illustrated graphic novels about scientific topics. You know, he has a background in neuroscience, so he did a whole comic about how like the brain actually works. So really cool stuff. Obviously links to purchasable things in the show notes for this episode. Jason's webcomic is free, obviously.
I have a question for you. So at sessions like that, do people stand up in the audience and say, why, I do comics too, and that like this is what I do with my science? Or is it really just two people talking at a group of people sitting in a chair?
Yeah, I mean, AAAS was an interesting meeting. I hadn't really been to a meeting that was structured that way, where it actually is a little bit more like a comic convention in that there are other kinds of sessions. So most of the time when I go to a session at a science conference that's dedicated to like a specific kind of science, sessions tend to be moderators who just introduce the speakers and read the titles and keep things moving. And then a speaker who's usually sitting in the audience gets up, gives their 12 to 15 minute talk, takes a few questions, sits back down.
Right.
This was Jason and Matteo both giving a little spiel, both about themselves and about the philosophical way that comics can be used. And they had some PowerPoint slides to go along with that. And then when they were done with that, it kind of became a freewheeling discussion where people from the audience were asking questions and follow-ups. And I think they even had intended, we talk about this a little bit in the interview, to have us all try to like actually draw some comics there as an interactive activity.
Oh, cool.
And then I think this gets mentioned in the interview as well, but they were supposed to have a third participant with them, and she actually helped them submit the session to AAAS, but unfortunately she was not able to attend the conference because of the travel ban. So,
no.
Or she couldn't, so I think she's from one of the countries on the travel ban and couldn't get a visa.
Dang it.
Yeah, so pretty frustrating.
So at, like you were at that session, yes?
Yes.
Okay. I know that you have read Understanding Comics and Making Comics because you got them for me.
I had to read them for a class.
Okay, well, I know that too, but
the listeners might not. We're not just talking to you right now. Charlie didn't know that. I never told Charlie about the class that I took.
Charlie, you dum-dum, you
Charlie,
didn't know.
The class where Jesse and I met.
Oh, okay. So rewinding. So for someone who has read something like Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics or Making Comics, which I know you've read because you took that comic class at Santa Cruz, and then of course I've read because I live with you. Like, was their session pretty similar to the kinds of materials covered in?
No, not really. So they focused a little bit on that, mostly about kind of McCloud's ideas of, so McCloud spends a lot of time in the first volume of his kind of 3-volume series about sort of the mechanics of comics. And I plug that in the interview. Like, if you want to know more about how comics actually function as a medium, go read Understanding Comics by Scott McCloud. It's amazing. They mostly focused on the stuff he says about degrees of abstraction. And so, because so much of science is like abstract concepts, so how do you like draw that? And how do you like take something that's even more abstract than like an emoticon face, you know, 3 lines making up a face? And how do you take something that's even headier than that and put it into a graphic format? And then they also, a lot of the session was just like, don't be scared to try this yourself.
Right.
We all got started just because we doodle all the time. And so like if you have doodles and you try to like explain your science with a doodle,
right,
try consider putting that on a poster, or consider using that as part of your outreach on Twitter.
Yeah.
And so it was a lot of just like overcoming the hurdle, overcoming the stigma of comics as sort of a thing for kids.
Now, this also reminds me of a Guild of Natural Science Illustrators talk that I went to, because they actually got another comic book artist to come on and talk about his work of, like, he was a science graduate student and started using comics as the best way to explain his research. And I know science illustration is so important in any field, whether it's like, you know, molecular cell bio or paleontology or anything else. Yeah, ichthyology. So I wonder, like, how many people in that session were also familiar with, you know, having scientific illustrations in their work, but learning about comics as a way of taking it one step further to make it a more narrative process.
Yeah, I didn't get a strong sense of that. It was mostly just about, it seemed to me less about how to use comics to supplement your scientific research and more just how to use comics to explain your scientific research. So anyway, with that, I think let's listen to the first part of the interview that I did with Jason and Matteo, and we'll be back in just a minute for some drinks.
Let's listen. Let's shall.
Okay. So we are recording now. I'll let you guys go ahead and introduce yourselves so I don't mispronounce any names or get any affiliations wrong.
I'm Jason McDermott. I'm a computational biologist with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and I also do Red Pen, Black Pen, the webcomic that's science-oriented.
I am Matteo Farinella, and I'm a presidential scholar in society and neuroscience at Columbia University, where I study science communication, and I also draw comics.
Yeah, and so you guys just wrapped up a session here at the AAAS meeting about science and comics. And your session was about 90 minutes, and it was you guys talking a lot about your personal experience trying to translate science into like graphic novel or comic book or graphic comic strip style communications and the experience you've had doing that. So can you kind of give us like the big picture of what the session was trying to cover in the 90 minutes you had?
Yeah. So for my part, I was really interested in talking about, you know, why this is something that I've been thinking about for a while, is why comics are a great medium for scientific communication. And so I tried to give a little bit of history on how I got into scientific comics, and then tried to follow up with the ideas that I think are most important for why comics might be a good method for communication. And that included highlighting a paper that I wrote last year that was basically how can you draw scientific comics?
The 10 Simple Rules one?
10 Simple Rules.
Yeah, I was really glad you went through those rules. And I don't want to run through all 10 of them here, but it is, because it's a PLOS journal, it's publicly accessible for anyone. So we'll link to that in the show notes for the episode. I have it up here in front of me on my iPad right now. So that was super helpful. And I was glad that felt more instructional than theoretical, which was nice. Right. That there was like a practical application for the people in attendance.
Career workshop that we had. Maybe give some actual advice on how to do it. Yeah, and then trying to cover some of the examples of how I've used science comics and how science comics have been used in research.
Yeah, similarly, I started with my own work, but the goal for me when I give this kind of talks and workshop is, I really try to take a step back and think more broadly why comics could be particularly good for science communication. So instead of just talking about my books and comics in general, I'll just try to make the connection between the challenges we have in science communication and how comics can maybe help us solve some of those challenges.
Yeah, Jason, you had a really good figure with the activation energy and how like comics can be used as a stepping stone to kind of get up over that hurdle.
Yeah. So that's something that I've thought about a lot, which is this communication divide between disciplines in science, but also between kind of the scientific community and the lay community, is that it can be very daunting, even within disciplines. If I go to a conference and I'm looking at sitting at a talk that's highly statistically oriented, a lot of times it's off-putting to me. I'm like, I don't understand what all those equations are about. I don't understand why you're doing this. And it may be apparent to a lot of other people in the room, but it's not to me. And so that energy barrier is really a big thing. And I feel like comics, as well as other kinds of scientific communication, but comics kind of blend art and can incorporate humor to lower that energy barrier where people find it more approachable.
And just because I don't think we said in your guys' introductions, what kind of scientists are you both? Do you identify as when you tell people what the kind of work you do?
I'm a computational biologist. I use computers and algorithms to analyze large amounts of data to try to answer biological questions and to generate biological hypotheses.
That's nice. I don't know how to define myself anymore. I have identity crisis every week because I started as a biologist and then switched to computational neuroscience, biology. So already that was a big shift, and I could really relate to your cartoon.
Oh yeah, the one with the divide.
I hadn't seen that one, but yeah, that was very much my experience as a biologist trying to do computational studies, but still somehow biologically relevant. And then, I complicated things even more by becoming a freelance cartoonist, and now I'm doing this interdisciplinary research, which mix neuroscience, mostly psychology, educational science, and science communication.
Now, many comic book characters have an origin story. So do you guys have your comic origin story? Like, were you always doodlers? Did you read comics growing up? What was kind of your entry into the medium?
So I've always doodled, and when I was a kid, I liked to draw and do things like that. In my professional life up until about 6 years ago, I didn't really use that other than kind of thinking about how to do better graphic layout for scientific posters or something like that. Yeah, and then about 6 years ago, a colleague made a comment that kind of struck me very visually, and I immediately went back to my office and I doodled it down, and that's that Uncanny Valley comic or cartoon.
Where you have like biologists on one side and
computer scientists on the other, and then computational biologists being right in the middle like a zombie. And it was a very, very simple stick figures and kind of rough. It probably took me 5 minutes to draw. And at the same time, I was starting to get active on Twitter, and I posted it and got a lot more response than I had ever gotten from anything else. And that kind of started to kind of kick things off, where I started to do it more. I was like, this is kind of fun. I like it. It fits a piece of me that I hadn't really been exercising before.
For me, yes, I have always been a comic reader, comic fan, although I grew up in Italy, and so not exactly the kind of superhero comics we find here, but Italy, like France, has a long history of comics and
as like a respected art form.
Yeah, exactly. So for me, it wasn't even such a weird thing. Everyone was reading comics. Everyone was doing comics. It's much more socially acceptable, I guess. But so for some reason, I guess I was a victim of the stereotypes we still have. So when I was drawing comics, I was trying to write about fiction or science fiction or, like fantasy things, like things we associate with comics. And then I was always drawing. I was drawing even during my science class all the time. My notes are basically comics. But it took me like 10 years to make the connection, I could actually do this in a comic. I don't know why it took me so long.
And you both referenced Scott McCloud's seminal Understanding Comics work. So I would say for folks listening to this who've not read that, it is as informative as a textbook, but it is super easy to actually digest because Scott McCloud's really good at making comics. So I just want to put that out there as like, if you haven't read that or checked that out, it will help you understand the rest of our conversation a lot better, probably. But yeah, so once you were bit by the comic book bug, like what kind of happened to you guys next that actually enabled you to incorporate making comics as part of your scientific career, scientific journey?
So I had a moment a couple of years ago. So I'd been on Twitter and had gotten a following for a lot of the science, and a lot of the stuff that I do is humorous. It kind of is commentary on the scientific process and peer review and other kinds of things. And I went to a conference that I've been to a bunch of times before, and I was hanging out with a friend who took me and introduced me to the table as Jason McDermott, and everybody kind of nodded in my direction, and then they said, "Oh, and he draws red pen, black pen," and immediately the whole table was like, "Oh, really? You're the guy behind red pen, black pen?" And at that moment, that was my identity crisis, because I felt like, wait, people know me way better for red pen, black pen than they do for my science, which made me feel a little bit weird, because I'm like, shouldn't my science be more important? But after that process, because of that, but also several other things that happened, I felt like I started to try to figure out how I could incorporate comics more into my scientific process. So the easiest that I've done it is I've drawn some posters. So I've actually drawn comic posters that I've taken to conferences. And it's really, really clear when you start doing that one, the standard format of scientific posters is just not very engaging. And two, you get a huge amount of engagement with using some metaphor, using graphic elements.
And for people who haven't been to a scientific conference, posters at a scientific conference are basically the adult version of like a science fair project. Like they're kind of
exactly.
They're columnar. They tend to have like boxes full of type in them. They're not easy to digest always, especially given the constraints of like you're walking past a poster in a crowded poster hall, and a lot of times the author presenter will be there for a couple of hours at the conference to talk about it. But I often find that without the author present, it can be very difficult to necessarily make sense of the poster. And I, like you, I don't have your artistic talent, but because I'm such an avid comic book reader, I 100% think about my posters in terms of panel flow. Like, where does the eye actually move across the board to actually show the narrative arc that I'm trying to get across, so that by the time you make it from the top left-hand corner to the bottom right, you should know what I think my story is. And so I loved that you pointed that out, and you've taken it a step further by actually making them graphic.
Yeah, and I feel like making them graphic does a couple of things. It is lowering that energy barrier. And like I said, it's not just with scientists and non-scientists. It's between scientists. I approach many posters and I'm like, this is intimidating to me. I don't want to step forward and talk to this person necessarily, because I'm not really sure what you're doing, and it's not very approachable.
Well, for me, when I give a talk about my work, even if I'm at a pretty specific conference where I know that most of the people in the room are going to be broadly familiar with the topic I'm talking about, I would still say a third to even half of my talk is introducing everything so that nobody is lost by the time I get into my methods and my results. Whereas with most posters, you have a little box for background, and then you're immediately into your methods and your results, because you need that much space to show your figures and maybe even a table, that the poster setup doesn't really allow for you to really get everyone up to speed before diving into the meat of the project. Yeah,
that's certainly true. And you also see a lot of people taking their paper in progress and basically just cutting and pasting. And so you have your background section is actually, a couple paragraphs of pretty dense text. And then your methods are all on the poster along with your figures. And that kind of text density, I think, just is not very easy to understand.
Yeah.
Adding to that, I also want to say, I started to think a lot of comics as infographics. Like, they have a lot in common in the end. And the only problem, infographics, like posters, often are very dense and don't really offer a clear starting point or an intro. So I think comics just can take it a step further and provide, break down the information, more easily digestible steps, and then provide also a storytelling element or
storytelling, and I think just fun.
Yeah.
Like, it's comics are fun, right? Like they don't have to be funny, but they are.
But just like visually, yeah, they're more appealing.
Yeah, they're stimulating and they're engaging, and they draw you in a way that maybe a scientific figure doesn't. And Matteo, you had a joke that I loved that I think about with this podcast, because this podcast, we have an audience of people who listen and enjoy it and come back for every new episode. And you made a joke about more people reading your comic than reading your dissertation, and I feel the same way about this podcast. So can you talk a little bit about that?
No, also going back to the question, what like my entry point into this field of science comics was toward the end of my PhD. And at the time, so I've been writing and drawing comics for a while, but these were always, as I said, non-scientific themed. They were things I was putting on my blog, like that's what cartoonists are supposed to do. And the switch for me was, I had to give credit to my colleague and then co-author Hannah, who joined our lab. And I think that for me, the switch was that I met someone that she understood the science very well, but she also appreciated science communication. And so she was the first one from the scientific world to tell me, this is not just a funny thing you do, you don't have to keep it secret. This is actually useful, like science needs this. And I didn't have the confidence until then. And that's why what I'm trying to do now very often in my talks and my work is not only the theory part, but also much more applied work that is just giving other people visibility and talking about this field as something that is real. That's the only way we're going to make it.
And that's something else that I like about comics is the ability to abstract concepts and to level the playing field in your representation of concepts and ideas, which is, a lot of stuff that Scott McCloud talks about. But it would be very hard to do a comic like Neurocomic as maybe an animated movie without an entire studio working to make that happen. But as a comic, you can basically represent your lofty ideas in like really heady, cerebral and it's heady and cerebral. I'm talking about the brain, but you can draw that on the page in a way that very few other media could accomplish with the same level of funding. You know what I mean?
Yeah. That's why I always make the point. I don't think comics should try to imitate or replicate what movies are doing or what writing is doing, because they're already doing very well. I'm trying to really, I think, sell comics as something I can do something completely different. So all the topics we cannot cover in a movie or cannot make it exciting because there is nothing really to show except the scientist working at the bench, then then in a comic you can bring all that to life. And I think, that's something very powerful comics can do. And I hope to see more of that personally.
And you hope to see more of that, not just in your own careers, but you guys are out there advocating for this and trying to encourage other people to try this out. So that was something you talked a lot about at the session. So what would be your pitch to other scientists out there who maybe aren't sure about comics as a form of communication, or they're intimidated, they don't think their drawings are good enough? Like, how do you coach someone through the barrier?
That's a good question. I know I tend to talk a lot about, I give the, you don't have to be a great artist. That's the rule number one. I still think that is a barrier for a lot of people because they don't believe that they have good artistic skills, or that they're intimidated by that. So I don't really have a good answer. I think having people try it more and having people understand that a lot of what they're doing is not about the art itself. It's about the way that you're communicating and the message that you're giving and how you're giving that message. That's probably.
Yeah, no, that's good advice. And I would say, again, just start doing it. I think in the end, the best proof is going to be in the comics themselves. And I know it's hard. It was hard for me because it's not something it's encouraged. It's not something that is respected as being a writer or a filmmaker. But I think, as we discussed already, the barrier for entry is so low. All it takes really is pen and paper compared to this other medium, which often require a lot of tech and training. Anyone can draw a comic, and anyone can read a comic. So it's a very democratic medium. So just start doing. And personally, I don't really believe that you need special artistic skills like in anything. I think it's all about practice. It's not like we all think we can write, but doesn't mean we can write well. It takes a lot of practice to become a good writer. And the same thing with comics. If you're a scientist and you like drawing, just start doing it. Don't worry about what people say, and get better at it. And eventually you can show to people that this is something that works. Look at this complex idea I made very engaging.
And so how do you do that though? How do you start with a very complex idea and then actually decide what parts of it you want to represent, or how do you is it a simplification, or are you trying to maintain all the complexity of the idea? Like, what's sort of the thought process that you guys go through when you're putting an abstract idea into a comic?
I mean, I guess the first thing is to consider also, where you're going to publish or post your comic, and like who's your audience. So I would start with simpler things maybe, and like, short. I definitely advise to start short. Don't try to explain your whole field of research. Start with like maybe a talk you go to, and like take some notes and illustrate it.
Oh, that's a good idea. So like a short 12-minute,
that's something I think I started doing before Neurocomic, just going to talks, which I liked, just make a couple of drawings. And it doesn't have to be like too complex, literally just text and drawing, just to reinforce the key concepts. And then
so you're almost like storyboarding, like they would do for a movie, but you're just doing it on the fly just for fun. And that probably helps you retain the information of the talk better too.
Exactly. Yeah, definitely. I was doing it mostly for me. And then, if you feel good about it, put it online. Although, as an artist now, I don't want to tell people to put their work online for free. But if you're just starting, I think is a great way to get feedback and see what people like and people don't, especially, again, non-scientists, people they weren't at this talk, at the seminar, and they don't know about the subject, that they can actually read your comic, do that, and then they ask feedback to non-scientist friends.
Peer review.
Yes,
basically.
It works. It's painful, but it works.
It is very painful, as many of your comics attest to, Jason.
Yeah. So my method is oftentimes the metaphor comes to me first, and so I'm thinking about a topic, I'm thinking about something, and a metaphor will spring to mind. And sometimes that metaphor, the first one that springs to mind, is just like it turns out to be the perfect thing. An example, and I think I showed this in my talk, was the idea of umbrellas as vaccination. And that's a really powerful kind of metaphor. And does it completely cover all the nuances of vaccination and immunology? No, it doesn't. But it gets across, one point. Other times I feel like that sometimes those metaphors that seem really clear right at the start, you have to critically look at them, and they may be the kind of metaphor that might be leading down the wrong path. And so are there things that, you're like, oh, this would be a great metaphor, and then you're like, well, actually that kind of implies this and this and this about whatever system. And that's probably not what you want to imply, because people have strong ideas about the thing that you're talking about. And
it seemed like a lot of the questions you guys were getting, at the end of the session, you had a little bit of time for Q&A. And it seems like a big question that people were having who maybe aren't as familiar with the medium was just, at what point do you bring in the text to actually explain what it is you're trying to do? So that was part one of my interview with Jason and Matteo and their story of using comics to better explain their science. And
that's all there is to it.
How do we transition from that to a drink, I guess?
I don't know.
If you go to a comic convention...
Do you want to draw me a drink? No, let's tell the story of Isotope in the bar.
And if you have the good fortune to live in a city like San Francisco, which has the Isotope Comic Book Lounge, you should go there for one of their after-hours events, because you will find that one of the stations that they have books set up on during the day actually flips around and becomes a bar where you can get a drink. And
it will be comic book themed.
Yeah, so with that in mind, let's go have a drink.
Let's have a drink.
Okay, so it would not be an episode of Science Sort of if we didn't also talk about what we are drinking. Julie, I don't think you know what we're having.
Well, it was a word that was very similar to my mom's name, but then I just ignored it and didn't read the rest of the word.
Okay, so this is a beer called Astral Weeks. It's from Right Proper Brewing Company here in DC.
We have been there.
We have, and I have been lamenting the state of the DC beer scene a lot in recent episodes. So I figured I owed it to the DC beer scene to have a beer from the region on the show, or not from the region, from the city.
The region.
The district on the show.
Closer even than the DMV.
And this is a dry hopped foeder beer. Am I saying that word right? Do you think it's foeder?
Foeder?
Yeah, it's definitely French.
No.
So here's what they say about the beer.
Fode.
This Cosmic Alive beer was fermented in one of our large French oak. Yeah, the oak's from France, Julie.
Yeah, but that might not be the style of beer.
I think it's just a type of barrel.
Yeah.
With our house mixed culture of wild yeasts.
It looks like a German word.
It does look like a German word.
Yeah.
After ripening for months, it was dry hopped in the foeder with a generous amount of Euconaut and Comet.
In the foeder.
Venture into otherworldly sticky hops, bright acidity, and slip-streaming yeast magic.
Why did you think I would like this?
I didn't. I just thought it was local. Cheers.
No. Cheers.
It's not too hoppy. Right Proper tends to make very light beers.
It's light and it's dry in a weird way.
Yeah.
Not in a like wine can be dry way, but in a way where I'm like, oh, my mouth literally is drying out. It's like cotton absorbing stuff out of my mouth.
It smells like it's going to be on the sour side, but it's really not.
Yeah.
And I don't think
Yes, it does.
I don't think Right Proper makes bad beer. This is a low alcohol beer. It's 4.5%. A lot of their beers tend to be very sessionable, and in my experience, I find that I think a lot of their beers I don't sense a ton of variation when I go there and like have a couple of different beers. They're all kind of a piece of sort of being slightly sour, slightly light.
Yeah. It's a place that is good at a thing of a like slightly sour, sessionable beer that's quite nice on a really hot and humid day.
Which happens in DC.
Which happens in DC a lot. So like, if you want that kind of beer, you should go there.
I think have the best food of any brewery in town. No, I guess
It depends what food trucks are out.
I guess Blue Jacket has pretty good food, too.
Oh, yeah.
Blue Jacket's food might be a little better.
I like Blue Jacket's beer, too.
Yeah, Blue Jacket does make good beer. But this was the beer that I was able to get for this week.
I feel really bad for... We're just like half-ly plugging.
No,
Right
but I mean,
I've
been kind of ragging on the DC beer scene in general, and so I wanted to at least, do right by them and have a beer on the show. And like, I think this is proving my point that like I'm not as excited as I want to be by the beer in DC. I think it's getting better, but... Okay,
but here's my question. How many other places have we lived where you've been super excited about the beer scene? Because, like, in Nashville, weren't a ton of breweries.
No, in Nashville, the beer scene was sad, but we had, like, really good beer festivals that would come to town.
And we had good distribution.
Yeah.
Of, like, other things. But I feel like we have the same in DC. Like, we've never
been to a beer festival in DC.
No, we haven't been to a beer festival, but they have good distribution here of good stuff.
I'm definitely, when I rank
we can finally get Avery here.
When I rank the beer places I've lived, California and the Rocky Mountain West, like those are two of the best beer places in the country. So,
yes.
It's outside of like Portland and Asheville. Like you're not doing better than being in the Rockies or being on the California coast. So
right, yeah.
I'm spoiled. I admit that. I have high standards. DC is more of a cocktail town than a beer town. So it's just not the most fertile ground, I think. But, it's getting better. And we recorded a show at Atlas recently, and I had a good beer there. So
how did that go for sound?
Fine. It was a quiet weekday night.
Gotcha.
I think there was only like 2 or 3 other groups there, but that's not important to the show. What's important to the show is that...
How dare you? People want to know. Good people want to know, Ryan.
The important thing is that I finished my conversation with Jason and Matteo, and we're going to go wrap that up in the second part right now. at what point do you bring in the text to actually explain what it is you're trying to do? Because it seemed like maybe there were some misperceptions that like the text is just the caption for the image as opposed to part of the story. And you guys talked about the role of lettering and how that can influence the perception of the story. So when you guys are making comics, at what point do you think about where the drawing ends and where you want to start explaining things with words?
So for me, as I already mentioned also during the talk, I think maybe I start with a lot of text. Like you can even start with all text. Like as you
start with a fully scripted.
If you're writing an article, and then basically work back from there. What can you cut from the text and explain it in the picture? Okay. And I think what most people maybe struggle with is like once you have this perfect text written, you want to leave everything. But if it's already in the picture, you don't need the text. And then my approach is to cut as much as possible from the text to make the story flow more.
So for you, it's all about just taking like the fully formed chunk of marble and then like chipping away the parts you don't need.
You know what you want to say, and then just starting to put it in the visual as much as possible.
Did you guys hear about how when Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons were working on Watchmen, Alan Moore would write these scripts that were just pages upon pages for like a panel, and Dave Gibbons would just go through with a highlighter and just highlight the things that he actually needed to draw, because Alan Moore had just so overwritten the book to the point of absurdity where, the feelings it was supposed to evoke and all this other stuff, and Dave's like, I just gotta draw this thing.
It's like a great process. I mean, it's very time consuming, but comics take a lot of time. I feel like in a way, like it's like, you put all the work, but the author has to put all the work ahead to make it easier for the reader, in a way.
And I want to give you a chance to answer the question too, Jason. But like comics also provide all these really cool learning opportunities. Like there's trends that you'll see on Twitter where somebody will put out just their pencils for a page or a panel or even just a character, and then all these different inkers will come through and just ink it in their own style. And you can see how like each step of the process can add such a different spin to the storytelling. And you can do the same thing with, if you're interested in drawing and want to try your hand at a comic book, there are authors who have put out their scripts, and so you can go get a script and you don't ever have to read the book, and you can just try to draw your version of that comic, and then you can go look at the published comic and see if you like your version better or where you could have changed things or what route you took differently. And like I think comics make that much, again, that barrier to entry is so low. You need a pen and paper that comics let you do. It'd be very hard to do that with a movie, like take a movie script and remake a film, unless you're Gus Van Sant and you're obsessed with Psycho. But like, I think, exactly what you said, like with comics, you can really just make it your own in any way that you choose.
Yeah, special effects are free.
Exactly. That's the best thing about comics. There's no budget.
And that's really, you actually mentioned something that would, a couple of things I think that would make good workshop material, where you could actually come up with a comic, you could have a script, you could have people fill in, their idea of what it was, and then, that might be kind of fun thing to do. What was that? The question was about
when you start bringing in the text.
Right,
like what role does the text play?
For me, that's been a hard thing, and it's actually somewhere where like medium like Twitter really help. Especially old Twitter rather than newer Twitter.
Old Twitter made me, I think, a very effective abstract writer for conferences where the word limit is horrendously short. And I'm just like, I'm going to put this in Twitter and figure it out.
You just go back and, you overwrite, and then you go back and you just brutally take out all those words that you don't need. But balancing that, sometimes it comes down to trying to objectively look at your work in progress and say, are people really going to understand this? Are they going to understand all the parts that I think they should be understanding? And sometimes, you need to add more graphic elements, or you need to clarify graphic elements. But other times it's like, well, I just need to put a label on this, or I need to have them saying something. And so I feel like I struggle with that balance and that process more than almost anything else in the comic.
And this came up a little bit during the Q&A, but can you guys talk just very briefly about like how what you're doing is different than just scientific illustration or just making a figure for a paper? Because those are two things that scientists are expected to incorporate into their work. Like as a paleontologist, paleo art is a huge part of the field. Like it even if it's taking some artistic liberties, it's still contributing to the perspective that you're trying to generate when you're putting your work out there. And then also scientists are often asked to do things graphically, like create figures. And so can you kind of just make sure that the distinction between scientific illustration versus comics is clear? And then also like what can scientists learn about making figures from studying comics? I know those are two kind of different questions, but it came to me in the moment.
I mean, personally, yeah, I'm not very good at distinctions. Like even defining comic is really hard.
Yeah, defining comic is really hard.
I think, I don't have much experience in scientific illustration. I think, again, when I think about scientific illustration, I guess the goal is similar in the sense you are simplifying down to the fundamental steps and lines, but you're trying to be as accurate as possible. So like to get the right measure, the right scale and size. In comics, I guess, you can take much more freedom. And in a way, like you are sometimes deliberately distorting the original material. So you know what the cells look like, but if you're trying to turn it into a character, maybe there are some things you have to drop that like they don't need to show. So that's the difference. And I think the hard part for scientists that we are so used to
including
figures.
Every single detail.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But also, as I mentioned in my talk, I think infographics, comics, figures, data visualization, like they can all in the end be merged together. Like of course, we should keep them separate. They have different goals and different audiences, but they can borrow from each other.
I feel like a lot of times, and there's a continuum, but with scientific illustration, there's less of an emphasis on story and character than there is on representation. And
that's good. That's good. Yeah.
So you're kind of trying to represent an idea. And I say that with the caveat that I think there are plenty of scientific illustrations that use elements of metaphor and use elements of storytelling and characters in them. But I would say kind of the standard is to depict what's there rather than kind of try to tell a story with.
And I think also to depict what's important about what's there. There's
right.
there's an emphasis with scientific illustration that isn't necessary. It's basically, why wouldn't you just take a photo? Because sometimes the thing you actually want to be shown gets lost in all the details of the photo. And I think kind of what you were saying, Matteo, is that as scientists, it's very hard for us to say that any bit of information shouldn't be there if it's possible to give it. And that sort of reminded me of an image I think, Jason, you showed during your portion of the talk, where depending on your mode of communication, sometimes you're putting more burden on the person receiving the information, the reader, the viewer, whatever, versus trying to take that burden on as the storyteller. And it sounded like the argument you were making is that a really data-rich or data-dense piece of text can put more burden on the reader, whereas something like a comic, the digestibility, the ease of taking that in is done because you did the hard work, is taken on by the creator and not put onto the reader.
Right. And I think that goes right to the poster discussion, which is I feel like, and I've definitely been guilty of this many times, where it's like, I have a poster, I have to present it at a meeting next week. I haven't even started on it. How can I do this? I'm just going to dump the information on the page and kind of try to arrange it in the same way. And right. And it's a low effort for the scientists because they're like, I know all about all this. I know why it's important. I know how to follow this story from one end to the other. But the reader is not, right? They're on the other side of that, which is, unless they happen to be one of the other experts in the field that, do come to posters and that may be very interesting to them, most of the people looking at that poster will be like, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah.
If I can add to that, thinking about the distinction, maybe it's more a distinction of audience rather than figures, illustrations versus comics. But I'm thinking of comics, at least in my work, is mostly for the general public. So I guess when you're making scientific figures, it's important that you put every single detail because the goal is for someone in your field to understand exactly how this thing is made. But in comics, I started to think more about what does the general reader, like the average reader, even if it's really...
If such a thing exists.
This mythological figure, the average reader. Not to get too technical, but in my book, Neuroscience, do they really need to understand exactly how neurotransmitter receptor is made, how many subunits, that it's a protein across the membrane? No. What I'm trying to convey is what's the function. So you can draw it as a trapdoor with a keyhole and a key. And in the end, it doesn't matter. It's the main thing is when it's open and when it's closed, and how different drugs interfere with the neurotransmitter action. So whether it keeps it open for longer or prevents it to open. So you're trying to communicate the mechanism rather than the actual structure or something.
And this is my first time at this meeting, at the AAAS meeting. What is special about this meeting that made you guys want to talk about your comic work here as opposed to a conference that's specifically about your discipline?
Yeah, this is my first time at AAAS as well. But when I was following it the last couple of years kind of on Twitter, I found that there was a lot of science communication. There's a lot of kind of how do you better get your ideas across? And I was really excited by that. And I think there was like a session last year that was not science comics, but it was something about drawing and illustration and scientific communication. And when I saw that, I was like, hey, this would be really cool to do something at AAAS. And with more specific conferences, I feel like that there might be an audience for that, but a lot of times those conferences, they're not really designed to be talking about scientific, maybe they should be, but scientific communication and that kind of thing. And so there seems to be less interest from the conference itself on those specific conferences.
So this conference happened to be very fertile ground for you guys.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, personally, I don't even know what's my field anymore, but I actually enjoy a lot now going to conference and completely different fields like data visualization or history of science. I experiment a lot, and I try to always basically bring in comics in a way that is relevant to that audience. But I think here is much easier because this conference is a lot about science communication and science policy, and even at the scientific session, I think maybe there are scientists that are a bit more tuned to speaking to a general audience or to speaking across their disciplinary boundaries. And I think comics can be very good for all these things. So I really wanted to come here and talk about comics.
So the broadness of the meeting is actually a strength.
Yeah.
The fact that there's so many different kinds of disciplines here. So before I let you guys go, I want to just ask you guys what some of your favorite comics are. I mean, you mentioned a few of them during the session. We've had science comic book people on this podcast before. We had Beatrice, biologist, who you've mentioned in your slides. We also had Abby Norman, who does comics about the Mesozoic and has a new one coming about the Paleozoic. So a lot of paleo-themed comics. I'm a big fan of the book Xander Cannon did about evolution, which his art style reminds me a lot of yours, Matteo. I think you guys have like a very similar kind of thick line cartooning.
It was by Jay Osler, which I think is...
Yeah, I think he wrote it and then Xander drew it. I couldn't remember who.
But Jay Osler is also a cartoonist, one of my heroes, because he is actually both scientist and a cartoonist and a science educator. So he's actually doing what I'm trying to do, like using comics in the classroom and try to compare whether they work or not, more or less in a textbook.
Yeah. So, XKCD has been a big influence on my work.
Yeah, your style is more of a webcomic style than like a printed and bound.
Yeah, definitely. And I've started to kind of explore more the different kinds of art I can be doing, and so that's been a little bit daunting because I don't have great artistic skills, as I probably mentioned, but it's been fun. So XKCD is a great inspiration, which is just very, very simple stick figure drawings and is able to convey a lot of things. Some of his infographics are more complicated and have a lot of information.
Yeah, and we've talked about the Upgoer 5 challenge on the podcast a lot, and I participate. There's an Upgoer 5 session at one of the meetings I go to where I often give a talk, and I have to talk about some aspect of my research using the Upgoer speak. So yeah, he's definitely influenced SciComm in a lot of ways beyond just his actual entertainment value.
I'm really excited about some of the starting out comic artists and people who aren't as well known, and some people who aren't even comic artists yet or don't know it. I was at a conference on cancer systems biology, and one of the attendees, who was a graduate student, started posting her sketch notes, and it was really interesting because there was somebody else there. We tracked her down and we were like, these are really good. She was like, oh, I just kind of put them out there. Really, you think they're really good? And they got lots of retweets and stuff. And so we're trying to kind of talk to her about how can you do this more? Are you interested in doing it more? And so I don't have specific call outs there, but there's definitely a number of people who seem to be more kind of tending toward that way or interested in doing that. And it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, it's exciting to know that there's going to be more coming down the pike in the future, that we haven't reached anywhere near saturation for how many good science comics.
Yeah, I feel like I want to mention some, just because part of what I'm doing is collecting all these comics, and I'm very excited about more than maybe this I guess more old time. I've been doing this for a long time. I mentioned Chris Ware in my talk, and it's my.
You did mention Chris Ware in your talk.
It's not about science, and about it was a big inspiration in the sense of how complex
his comics intimidate me. I'm scared. I'm scared of them.
But I'm much more excited, about all the new people, maybe doing it online.
And Matteo, you're gonna. I hadn't mentioned this before because I wanted to chat first, but I have actually had your Science Comics Superpowers article for American Scientists on our list of things to talk about on the podcast, just because I'm and I didn't realize until you started talking about it. I was like, oh wait, I get to interview him now. This is perfect. So you both have written about the role that comics can play, and so I'll be sure to link to all those different things in the show notes. Yeah,
and I have this Cartoon Science website where I'm trying to collect all these names. So rather than calling out specific people, I guess it's a good place to start. But I think it's Jen Wong that is she's doing also this comics mix science and politics, and basically thinking more about the social aspect of science. So a scientist to talk more about what we are doing, all the biases we have, and I think comics could be a great way to talk about these topics, which are very complex and kind of boring for
Sorry, we're getting
general audience, but it's okay.
Let me check and see who that is real quick. I only have one more question. So one last question before I let you guys go is, I couldn't let you leave without plugging your own stuff. So you mentioned that you're on Twitter. You mentioned that you also have websites, but can you just tell people where in the world to go find your stuff and follow along with your science and comics adventures?
Yeah, for me, that's Twitter is probably a great place to go. I also have an Instagram, which I'd love to get more followers on Instagram. I have a Facebook page. All of those are under Red Pen, Black Pen, spelled exactly like you'd think.
And we'll link to it on the show notes so people can find it.
Yeah, and it's Matteo Farinella. If you can spell it right, I'm very easy to find, both on Instagram and Twitter. And cartoonscience.org is the website where I'm collecting.
And you also have books out that people can go buy.
Neurocomic, The Senses, and there's a children book in Italian, but it's not out yet in English.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for joining me, both of you. I really appreciate it.
No problem.
All right, thanks.
Thank you.
All right, well, thanks again to Jason and Matteo for giving me some of their time sitting down at the meeting. This was, we recorded our conversation literally right after their session. They wrapped up their session. They talked to the last couple of people who were hanging around to talk to them, and then we walked over to a room and recorded things. So I was really happy to talk to them. They've both written pieces about their ideas for using comics to communicate science. So Jason wrote a piece called Drawing Connections, and Matteo wrote a piece called Science Comics Superpowers, and they both have stuff for purchase. Jason has some merch available based on his webcomic Red Pen, Black Pen, and Matteo has graphic novels that you can purchase. So just go over to Science Sort of. The show notes for this episode will have links to all of that. And if you read any of those comics and want to tell us what you thought, you can write into the show and tell us, and you might get featured in our final segment of the show, which is the PaleoPOW, coming up next.
Wham, bam, pow!
Comics aren't just for kids anymore. The PaleoPOW is the portion of the show where we invite and enjoy feedback from the listeners. Now, did you know, you probably knew this, that
He's directing this at me, dear listeners.
a lot of stuff we do on the show, a lot of the development of the show is just stuff I've stolen from my fanboy over the years. I don't think that's a secret. And their show is the Pick of the Week podcast. And if you figure out what the acronym for Pick of the Week would be, it would be POW. So the idea for
it would be POTU.
Pick of the week. Well, we're ignoring the other words to make my point. So, because this was a show about science comics, and because I'm still affiliated with the iFanboy guys, I still go on the Pick of the Week shows regularly, and their special edition shows, and the Animation Brain Trust. I thought we would do an all iFanboy inspired PaleoPOW this time.
Are you stealing like all the fan mail from iFanboy, and you're just reading it on this show instead?
All right, sort of.
Science. Sort of.
The last time I was on iFanboy for their Pick of the Week show, it was me and Josh, and something came up where I mentioned that one of my greatest fears is getting trapped in a bubble of water in zero gravity.
That's never come up in our relationship.
Well,
how has that never come up in our relationship?
I didn't know you couldn't whistle until we got a dog. So there's lots of things you learn about a person. So, Martín, a former guest of the show that I talked to in one of the AGU episodes, wrote in to assuage my fears. So this is a scientific response to a thing that I brought up on iFanboy. So it technically is a piece of feedback for iFanboy, but go listen to that episode of iFanboy Pick of the Week. I can't remember which episode it was. So
just start from the very beginning,
right,
and work your way up.
Their show's been going even longer than ours. I'll look up what episode it was. Give me a second.
This is just to say this is a very heavy, like, comic book science crossover episode.
Have you read any good comics lately?
I guess the last one was the Wicked and Divine special series, where they have, like, all the compilations of the different time periods and where they're all dogs instead of gods and blah, 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 blah. What else have I read?
I haven't given you the issues for Kieran's new series yet. Die.
You have not.
Yeah.
What have I read?
Paper Girls? Still reading Paper Girls?
I think we got off track with my numbering on it. So
that's a time travel book.
I know.
Read them out of order. Who cares?
Doesn't matter. Let's see. I have to lean over to look at our collection.
I bought Berlin last time we were at Isotope, and I haven't had a chance to read it yet, but James spoke very highly of it.
What did I buy? Ooh, I bought that. So again, another Isotope purchase. So yay, James. It was the second in a series that this French dude does about, like, the first book was set during World War II with, like, resistance people in Paris. Mm-hmm. And then the second book is set there's another book set during World War II that is a different character, but part of that same universe. And it's talking about, like, their experience, and it kind of goes back a little bit in time.
Cool.
And then the third book is set during World War I, and it's only halfway through. But those were all beautiful.
Nice.
Really good. Do you want me to find the names of them right now? I probably should if I'm talking about them on the show.
As long as they're in the show notes.
Okay.
Go see the show notes.
Go to the show notes. One of them is called Flight of the Raven, and I will find out the names of the rest of them.
And the episode in question was Pick of the Week number 680, where the pick was Action Comics 1010. So Martín wrote in to tell me to fear not the bubble of water in quote-unquote zero-G. Ryan, I was listening to this week's iFanboy, and I wanted to defang your fear you expressed of being embedded in a sphere of water in microgravity, which is a good point. Things like the space station exist in microgravity, not zero-G.
They're constantly falling
with style. Although your concerns are valid, I am mostly certain they can be addressed and overcome so that you can shift your fear to other myriad ways one can die in microgravity. You rightly note that buoyancy is no longer at your disposal, but conservation of momentum is still at your beck and call. Scuba divers, when using weights and other buoyancy compensation devices, can simulate the absence of gravitational influence. I imagine the hard part is getting their center of mass and the center of buoyancy and mass to coincide, while at the same time getting their average density to equal the surrounding fluid. And I'll butt in here to say that as a scuba diver, the trickiest thing I think about maintaining buoyancy when you're diving is that you're wearing a tank of compressed air, so the air's density is heavier than normal air, but when you breathe it into your lungs, it expands back out to a normal density, so your density is constantly changing every time you breathe in or out. And so you have to like figure out ways to maintain neutral buoyancy while still breathing.
And then add on to that, you have to grab your wife's hand so she doesn't go floating away.
Hold her down at the bottom of the ocean so she doesn't die, which sounds counterintuitive.
I was just slowly drifting.
That's how you
I wasn't shooting up in a way that would rupture my lungs.
Well, it's not rupturing your lungs I was worried about. I was worried about you getting the bends. Okay. Martín continues. The bottom line is that you should be able to swim to the edge of the spherical water bubble without significant effort. This contrasts with getting trapped at the center of an air-filled room in microgravity because you only have air, which is the density of 1 kilogram per meter cubed, to push against instead of water, which is 1,000 kilograms per meter cubed. Your concerns about surface tension once you get to the edge are harder to assuage. I have plausibility arguments for why you should be able to breach the surface tension across your face and breathe the air once you swim to the edge. You should be able to disrupt the surface by accelerating a small region outward and take advantage of a Rayleigh-Taylor instability-induced corrugation on the surface. My optimism relies on the unrelated fact that one can blow bubbles in underwater where forces like pressure and buoyancy act against it. That said, I'm not certain. I am on thinnest ice when I claim you can achieve sufficiently high an acceleration on the nearby fluid to break the continual wetting of surface tension. I typically ignore surface tension in things I study. The fluids are either fully miscible or relevant radii of curvature are so large that the surface tension is immaterial, because he studies the whole ocean.
Oh, well, yeah. That.
Keep up the good work, Martín. So, Martín, thanks for writing in. I feel slightly better about getting trapped in a bubble of water in microgravity, but it's still scary. Still wouldn't be pleasant. Right? Am I wrong?
I don't know.
Okay. So, Julie,
I've never been trapped in a bubble of microgravity.
Well, you've never been in microgravity.
You don't know that.
You've been in free fall, probably, but you've never been in microgravity.
You didn't know that I couldn't whistle. You don't know anything about me.
It's true. We're all figuring it out now that we got a dog, though. Mm-hmm. That's how you learn all of the things.
Yep.
The email I've picked out for you is from Sheli, who is also a part of the iFanboy community, and not our Sheli, a different Sheli. And based on some stuff that I talked about on a iFanboy podcast years and years ago about why does an animal man just carry small animals in his pockets so that he's he's always close to an animal with powers.
Who is Animal Man?
Animal Man is a comic book superhero who can take on the abilities of any animal that's nearby.
Uh-huh. How nearby does it have to be?
I mean, he can fly if he needs to. So, like, if a bird's in the vicinity,
He doesn't have to be touching it.
No. He's not an anamorph.
That's my question.
I'm telling you the answer.
That's what I'm asking.
My thought was, like, he should just have, like, a little mouse in his pocket. So that way, if he needs to, like, scamper up something,
But that means that he's always going to have to turn into a mouse.
No, he doesn't turn into the mouse. He stays in a human shape and just has their powers.
What?
Yeah.
Whoa!
So he doesn't, like, sprout wings when he flies. He just flies.
But you can't do that with human arms.
Sorry.
And our rib cage and our bones and
He got his power from aliens. I don't know what to tell you. He also, at one point, figured out that his life existed inside a comic book, and he turns around and looks out at the reader and says, like, I can see you. It's very freaky. Grant Morrison stuff.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, there you go.
Alien abductions and breaking the fourth wall.
That's what always weirded me out with the whole, like, Spider-Man is in a Spider-Man comic and knows about it in his world. And there is a Spider-Man comic that knows about MJ and everyone else.
Not
and I'm
important
like,
right
isn't he worried about their...
Not important right now.
Wouldn't all the villains have to do is let's just, like, read the comic and know who's important in his life?
None of that matters right now.
Okay, but listeners, please think about this.
You're not wrong.
Please get back to me.
About the Oscar-winning film, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. So,
I never said that was the problem with Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. I'm just saying it's a problem with Spider-Man in general.
So Sheli got inspired to draw. So we started off corresponding back and forth about my idea of Buddy Baker, aka Animal Man, carrying animals in his pockets, and then she just decided she wanted to draw dinosaurs with superpowers.
Oh, great!
So she drew a
people dressed as dinosaurs.
That was her first drawing
with superpowers.
Yeah,
got it.
I like Parasaurolophus Man and Ankle Sword Man, and I mean it's a pteranodon, not a dinosaur, but that's okay. It still looks cool.
Yep.
And then.
Oh no!
There's an elastic power.
Oh no!
So it's not a sauropod, and then becomes a sauropod. The very long-necked, long-tailed dinosaurs. And then she just drew two T-Rexes trying to box, and their faces are pressed up against each other. And
Gotcha.
A little dinosaur superhero saving his family from the asteroid.
I don't know what's happening in some
He's
of these.
putting on his superhero outfit.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So those were some cool drawings.
Excellent.
Another one with a little girl and her pet dinosaur dressed up as superheroes.
Excellent.
And she even did some art for a local Comic-Con in her region.
Nice.
And Sheli has actually contributed to the second volume of the Bandette series that I think was originally a Monkey Brain publication. So our buddy Chris's publication and an Eisner-winning comic. So you can go buy her work as well. So I will link to that in the show notes. And then
I will say one more thing about drawings of dinosaurs and stuff. With the opening of our new fossil hall, one of the social media campaigns that they have going on is going to be like dino doodles. So they're just encouraging anyone out there to draw dinosaurs and tag the National Museum of Natural History. So keep your eye out for that. And if you like drawing dinosaurs like Sheli does, do it.
So I just want to show you some cool drawings of dinosaurs.
Nice.
There you go.
Can I help? Nice. I like it.
It's a kid out walking his pet dinosaur, and he's now being lifted up off the ground.
It is possibly a T-Rex?
A very fluffy one. Maybe a Utah Raptor.
It's a feathery one. Well, its name is Rex.
True. But you could name... I mean, I named a dog Rex, and that dog was not a Tyrannosaurus Rex.
Nor was it a king.
Nor is it a king. Okay, well, I was going to ask if you have anything to plug, but you already plugged your exhibit. Do you want to tell people a little bit more about the new fossil hall?
Yeah, dinos are coming back to the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. So June 8th.
And then what happens?
Then it will be open for another like 20 or 30 years.
How much does it cost?
It's free.
Okay.
Well, I mean, how much did it cost us? I'm
I'm
not telling you that.
I was asking how much does it cost the public to go see it?
It costs you nothing other than however much it costs you to get to DC. Sorry, I can't help with that.
It's the Nation's Museum. It's for the people.
Well, we have the nation's T-Rex at the museum.
T-Rex. Any other good fossils?
I mean, the best fossils. We have an Eremotherium,
That's a type of ground sloth.
which is bigger than an elephant. It's fantastic.
Well, thank you very much, Julie, for helping me out and talking about comics.
You're welcome. I will always talk about comics, and I will usually help you out.
Excellent. Well, I very much appreciate it, and you and
Should
everyone
we wake
else.
up Charlie and try to get her to make a sound?
I don't want that.
Why not?
It's just 'cause
What if it
she's
sounds super cute?
very well? When she gets agitated, it gets very loud. So
Well,
can I finish the show, please?
No. Yeah, this is what you got yourself into. You knew when you asked me.
So that's all we have for this week. Next week, I am talking to Matthew LaPlante, who, in addition to being a professor of science journalism, also has a podcast called Undisciplined, which I was already on an episode of because they have a very fast turnaround time. So if you want to tune in to the April episode of Undisciplined, which is on Utah Public Radio and available as a podcast, you can hear me talking about some science news from the month of April that just was. So with that, come back next time and you'll get a whole lot more science.
Sort of.
And then get Charlie to say sort of, like Scooby-Doo's talking. All right, bye.
Here, wait. No, I'm going to wake her up. Make a sound. We got it.
Visit sciencesortof.com for show notes, links to all the stories we talked about, and ways to interact with the hosts, guests, and other listeners. Science Sort of is brought to you by the Brachiolobe Media Network of podcasts, with audio engineering by Tim Dobbs of the Encyclopedia Brunch podcast. That's all for this week. See you next time on Science Sort of.
PaleoPOWs. PaleoPOWs. What are we calling everyone?
They've always been the PaleoPOWs. That's never changed, but nobody's ever bothered to learn it.
Oh, no. Wait, what are you guys called? PaleoPOWs. There we go. All right.
Everyone also capitalizes the sort of, the S and the O and sort of, and it's not supposed to be capitalized, so.
Well, do they get the ellipsis or not?
Yeah, most of the time they get the ellipses.
Okay. I remember, where were we where someone recently had to say the name of your podcast and she didn't say it all together. So she's like, he has a podcast called Science.
Oh, then just,
sort of. And it came across of like, well, he sort of has a podcast.
Yeah. I don't remember where that was, but I remember you laughing about it.
It was great.